There is perhaps no figure in human history more compelling and mysterious than the villain archetype, a force of pure evil and the embodiment of chaos and destruction. While the hero is celebrated for their sacrificial selflessness, courage, and unwavering commitment to the greater good, the villain lurks in the shadows, embodying the darker aspects of the human psyche. The hero's journey is one of self-discovery and transformation, but it is the villain who forces the hero to confront their deepest fears, their suppressed desires, and their shadow self. The villain represents the shadow, the unknown, repressed, and hidden aspects of the human psyche, qualities that the hero must confront to achieve growth and wholeness. Without the villain, the hero's journey would lack depth and meaning. The villain is not a modern invention, but a timeless archetype, deeply rooted in our individual and collective psyche. Carl Jung was the first to describe the villain as an archetype, a universal inherited pattern of behavior or symbol that resonates across cultures. This resonance stems from its numinous nature, a quality that captivates and stirs our emotions. The villain, like all archetypes, is not part of a mechanical system, but a piece of life itself. Archetypes are images integrally connected to the living individual by the bridge of emotions. However, aligning oneself too closely with these archetypes can lead to psychological imbalance, often resulting in ego inflation. This state occurs when one's sense of identity becomes disproportionately amplified, fostering delusions of grandeur, megalomania, and ultimately, self-destruction. Archetypes operate on a primal level, closely tied to instinct rather than ethical or moral concerns. The role of the human ego is to temper these archetypal forces with a sense of moral responsibility. This task is crucial not only for our internal balance, but also for maintaining harmony in the external world. Carl Jung highlighted this challenge, stating, "The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man. Failure to understand them, or a shirking of ethical responsibility, deprives him of his wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness on his life." Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, requires integrating all aspects of our psyche, including the villain. The goal is not to suppress villainy, but to channel it constructively. Villain archetypes are not merely antagonists, they are mirrors, reflecting the parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the parts of us that refuse to be tamed. As Jung stated, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. The villain is the embodiment of our darkest impulses, our fears, and our unresolved traumas. But a huge mistake we make is to completely deny these traits within ourselves, which ends up biting us in the long run. If you're completely disgusted by someone's actions, it's important to acknowledge them as a human being and recognize those traits within yourself as well. Perhaps the first lesson to learn is that we are all villains in one way or another, just in different stories. In Greek mythology, this duality is vividly depicted in the story of Prometheus, the titan who sought to uplift humanity by stealing fire from the gods and gifting it to humanity. His act was driven by compassion and a desire to reduce human suffering, yet it defied the will of Zeus, the king of the gods. For his transgression, Prometheus was chained to a rock in the Caucasus mountain, and every day an eagle would feast on his liver. The liver would regrow each night, ensuring he suffered for eternity. His story illustrates the peril of being a villain in one story and a hero in another. While Prometheus is often celebrated as a benefactor of humanity, his rebellion against divine order casts him as a tragic figure, a villain in the eyes of the gods, yet a hero to mankind. This duality is central to the villain's appeal. They are not merely obstacles for the hero to overcome, but complex individuals with their own motivations, fears, and desires. Consider also the tale of Loki from Norse mythology. Loki, the trickster god, is neither wholly good nor evil. He is a shapeshifter, both a friend and foe to the gods, whose actions often lead to chaos, but also to renewal. Loki's betrayal of the gods, culminating in the death of Balder, the god of light, marks him as a villain. Yet, his role in Ragnarok, the end of the world, is also one of transformation. As the scholar Joseph Campbell noted, the villain is often the agent of change, the one who disrupts the old order to make way for the new. Loki embodies this paradox, reminding us that destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. Loki's story is a reminder that chaos is not inherently evil. It is a necessary force that disrupts stagnation and paves the way for renewal. In many ways, Loki is the ultimate trickster, a figure who defies categorization, who exists in the liminal space between order and chaos, good and evil. His actions, while often destructive, serve a greater purpose: to challenge the status quo and force the gods, and by extension, humanity, to evolve. One of the most compelling aspects of the villain archetype is their inherent tragedy. Rarely is a villain born evil. More often, they are shaped by circumstances, trauma, and the choices they make in response to their suffering. This tragic dimension adds depth to their character, blurring the line between hero and villain. Consider the story of Perseus and Medusa. Medusa, once a beautiful maiden, was cursed by Athena and transformed into a gorgon, a monstrous being with snakes for hair and a gaze that turned men to stone. She became a symbol of fear and destruction, a villain to be slain. Yet her story is one of tragedy and betrayal. Medusa was not born a monster. She was made one by the gods. Before her curse, she was a devoted priestess of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and they were bound by a vow of purity. But when Poseidon, the god of the sea, violated her within the sacred temple, she was not met with justice or mercy, only punishment. Athena, rather than directing her wrath at Poseidon, turned Medusa into a creature feared by all, exiling her to the desolate ends of the earth. There, in isolation, Medusa became the embodiment of terror, but also of power. Her gaze, once soft and human, became a weapon against the very world that had forsaken her. In her, we see the shadow of the divine, the darker side of power and justice. Another tragic figure is Macbeth, a man destroyed by his own ambition. Macbeth wasn't born a villain. He was a brave and loyal soldier, a man respected by his king and admired by his peers. But deep inside him, there was a hunger, a desire for more. And that hunger, when fed by the wrong choices, turned him into something monstrous. His story is a warning about the dangers of ambition and the cost of losing yourself to power. Macbeth was a Scottish general, a hero on the battlefield. One day, after a fierce victory, he and his friend Banquo met 3 witches. These witches spoke in riddles, but their words were clear. "Macbeth, you will become Thane of Cawdor, and then you will be king." At first, Macbeth laughed it off, but when he was named Thane of Cawdor shortly after, the seed of ambition was planted. What if the witches were right? What if he could be king? But there was a problem. The current king, Duncan, was a good man, and Macbeth was loyal to him. Duncan even trusted Macbeth enough to stay at his castle. But the idea of being king wouldn't leave Macbeth's mind. It gnawed at him, growing louder and louder until it drowned out his conscience. Macbeth's wife, Lady Macbeth, was just as ambitious as he was, maybe even more. When she heard about the witch's prophecy, she pushed Macbeth to act. "You could be king," she said. "All you have to do is take it." At first, Macbeth hesitated. He wasn't a murderer, but Lady Macbeth questioned his manhood, his courage. She made him feel small, and in that moment, his pride won out. One night, while Duncan slept under his roof, Macbeth killed him. It wasn't easy. He saw visions of a bloody dagger leading him to the deed. He heard voices, felt the weight of guilt even before the act was done. But he did it, and with that one choice, Macbeth's soul began to unravel. At first, Macbeth got what he wanted. He became king. But the guilt of what he'd done haunted him. He couldn't sleep. He saw Duncan's ghost. He became paranoid, afraid that someone would discover his crime. To protect his throne, he made more terrible choices. He killed his friend Banquo, who suspected the truth. He ordered the murder of Banquo's son Fleance, who the witches said would one day be king. He even slaughtered an innocent family, just to send a message. With each act, Macbeth grew colder, harder, more detached from the man he used to be. Lady Macbeth, who once pushed him to kill, began to crack under the weight of their guilt. She sleepwalked, trying to wash imaginary blood from her hands. "Out, damned spot!" she cried. "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." Macbeth's reign was built on fear and blood, and it couldn't last. His enemies gathered against him, and even his own soldiers began to desert him. The witches had given him one last prophecy: "No man born of a woman can harm you." Macbeth clung to those words, believing himself invincible. But he misunderstood. His enemy, Macduff, was born by cesarean section, technically not born of a woman. When Macduff confronted him, Macbeth realized too late that he had been tricked. In the end, Macbeth died as he lived, by the sword. But his death wasn't just the end of a tyrant, it was the end of a man who had once been noble, who had once had a conscience. His story is a tragedy because it shows how easily a good person can fall when they let their worst instincts take over. Macbeth isn't just a villain. He's a man who made terrible choices, yes, but he's also a man who suffered for them. His guilt, his paranoia, his descent into madness, they all feel deeply human. We see ourselves in Macbeth, not because we're all capable of murder, but because we all have ambitions, fears, and weaknesses. His story asks us, what would you do for power? How far would you go, and what would it cost you? Macbeth's tragedy is that he lost himself. He traded his honor, his friendships, and his peace of mind for a crown that brought him no joy. In the end, he realized it wasn't worth it. Life, he said, is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Those words are heartbreaking because they come from a man who once had everything and threw it all away. His downfall serves as a reminder that even the greatest among us can fall if we allow our desires and pride to overshadow our wisdom and virtue. Heroes and villains have the same backstory: pain. The difference is what they choose to do about it. Villains say, "The world hurt me, and I will hurt it back." But the hero says, "The world hurt me, but I'm not going to let it hurt anybody else." Heroes use pain, but villains are used by it. At their core, heroes and villains are defined by their relationship to pain and suffering. Both experience trauma, loss, and hardship, but their responses to these experiences set them on divergent paths. The hero chooses to rise above their pain, to use it as a source of strength and empathy. The villain, on the other hand, is consumed by their pain, allowing it to twist their perception of the world and justify their actions. This dichotomy is beautifully illustrated in the relationship between Batman and the Joker. Both are products of trauma. Bruce Wayne witnesses the murder of his parents, while the Joker's origin is shrouded in mystery and madness. Yet, where Batman channels his pain into a crusade for justice, the Joker embraces chaos, seeking to prove that everyone is as broken as he is. Their dynamic is not merely a battle of good versus evil, but a clash of philosophies, a debate about the nature of humanity and the possibility of redemption. Another example is Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars. Anakin's fall to the dark side is not a sudden descent but a gradual one, shaped by fear, loss, and the manipulation of those around him. As Yoda warns, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotion and the seductive power of the shadow. The word villain itself has evolved over time. It was first derived from the medieval Latin word villainous, meaning farmhand or peasant. Initially, it referred to someone of low social status or poor background, but over time it acquired negative connotations, eventually coming to signify the antagonist of a story. The villain is the obstacle, the force that challenges the hero and forces them to grow. Without the villain, the hero's journey would be meaningless. As Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." The villain is the crucible in which the hero is forged. But what about the hero? Ernest Becker, in his exploration of human psychology, argued that heroism is a reflex of the terror of death. One of the oldest stories on record is the Mesopotamian tale of the king, Gilgamesh, who, upon witnessing the unexpected death of his closest friend, becomes tormented by the realization that he too must die. "How can I rest? How can I be at peace?" laments Gilgamesh. "Despair is in my heart. What my brother is now, that shall I be when I am dead. I am afraid of death." Gilgamesh's fear is so acute that his life turns into a quest for immortality in the hope of countering death's approach. Gilgamesh begins his quest in search of a mythical elixir that will grant him bodily immortality, but he fails to attain what he seeks. And so he turns to what he considers to be the next best thing, the symbolic immortality conferred by heroism. His body may perish, but so long as his name and legend remain, Gilgamesh will live on in a symbolic form. To attain this type of immortality, he commits himself to great deeds and heroism that all the world shall know of. in order to stamp my name on men's minds forever, he declares. The tale of Gilgamesh, like so many ancient myths, contains a psychological truth which the 20th century cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker spent his career trying to decipher. This truth, according to Becker, is that of all things that move man, one of the principal ones is his terror of death, and that as a result of this fear, there is within each of us an innate urge to heroism. He wrote, "While most people would agree that, like Gilgamesh, they too fear death, few recognize that, also like Gilgamesh, they strive for heroism as a counter to this fear. The heroism that most of us participate in is not of the epic scale that defines Gilgamesh, and so is harder to detect. But according to Becker, the reason we don't recognize our heroism is because the form of it we seek is embedded into the value structure of our society." He wrote, "Mankind's common instinct for reality has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism. When it comes to the heroic scripts provided by a society, not all are equal. In fact, it can be argued that contemporary societies offer some of the worst heroic scripts the world has ever seen. For modern man, no longer steeped in the symbolism of religion and myth and having lost his connection to the rich roots of his cultural past, tends to strive for societal heroism in one of two ways: by going the way of the sheep or by participating in the race up the ladder of social success and status. The first approach, the way of the sheep, entails conformity and unquestioning obedience. In short, it is acting like a good citizen by towing the political agenda and party line. This may not seem like an effective path to heroism, as unquestioned obedience results in dehumanization and opens the way to a dystopic future. But this path to heroism does allow the sheep to identify with something felt to be more powerful and enduring than their small self, namely the state. And so, in the words of Becker, man earns his feeling of worth by following in the lines of authority and power internalized in his particular social group and nation. Each human slave nods to the next. Each earns his feeling of worth by doing the unquestioned good. "I only followed orders" is the phrase that rankles in the breasts of modern man. The second approach to heroism is taken by those who feel they can lift themselves slightly above the other sheep by attaining status and wealth. In answering Becker's question, "What is my contribution to the world?" or "Where do I rank as a hero?" the status and wealth-obsessed individual goes the way of the peacock. They seek to accumulate consumer goods, more expensive cars, and bigger homes, not primarily for practicality or enjoyment, but in the naive hope that social status, likes, and attention can alleviate their existential fears. It is wrong to say that man is a peacock if we mean thereby to belittle his urge to self-glorification and make it seem a mere matter of vanity and self-display. The constant harangue that we address to one another, "Notice me, love me, esteem me, value me," seems abasing and ignoble. But when we tally the sum of these efforts, the excruciating earnestness of them, the eternal grinding out of the inner newsreel, we can see that something really big is going on, really vital. Men, however, cannot go the way of the sheep or the way of the peacock for too long without suffering consequences, as these heroic scripts rank low on the scale of effectiveness. The villain, then, can be seen as an individual who has utterly failed in their attempts at social heroism. They reject the paths of the sheep and the peacock, finding them too absurd or too difficult to follow. Instead, they default to moral corruption, becoming anti-heroes who embody the failures of societal heroism. As Dostoevsky's Underground Man confesses, "I am a sick man, I am a wicked man, I believe my liver is diseased." The villain is the shadow of society, exposing the flaws and hypocrisies of its heroic scripts. What makes a villain truly compelling is not their evil deeds alone, it's the humanity beneath the darkness. Even in ancient myths and timeless literature, the most memorable villains are those who evoke a strange sense of sympathy, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that good and evil are not always clear-cut. The villain archetype not confined to the individual psyche, it can also manifest as a reflection of the collective shadow, a force that emerges from the darkest corners of society, embodying the fears and unresolved traumas of humanity itself. But what happens when villainy becomes a collective force? History is littered with examples of collective villainism. moments when entire societies driven by fear, greed, or ideology became agents of destruction. The Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany, is a stark reminder of how dehumanization and propaganda can turn ordinary people into perpetrators of evil. The transatlantic slave trade, which enslaved millions of Africans for economic gain, reveals how systems of oppression can persist for centuries, perpetuated by societal norms and institutions. And the Rwandan Genocide, where neighbor turned against neighbor in a frenzy of ethnic violence, shows how collective villainy can emerge from division and fear. These events are not merely historical tragedies, they are warnings. They remind us that the capacity for villainy lies not only within individuals but within societies. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do ordinary people become complicit in evil? How do systems of power perpetuate injustice? And how do we as a collective confront our own shadows? Collective villainism often emerges in the tension between progress and destruction. The Crusades, for example, were justified as holy wars to reclaim the Holy Land, but they resulted in widespread violence, pillaging, and cultural destruction. The Trail of Tears, where Native American tribes were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands, was driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, a belief in the inevitability of progress. But at what cost? These events reveal the duality of human ambition. The same drive that propels us to greatness can also lead to our downfall. So what drives collective villainism? At its core, it is a failure of empathy, a breakdown of the moral boundaries that separate us from one another. The Stalinist purges, where millions were executed or exiled as enemies of the state, were fueled by paranoia and the desire for absolute control. The Salem witch trials, where mass hysteria led to the execution of innocent people, reveal how fear and superstition can turn communities against themselves. And the Khmer Rouge regime, which caused the deaths of 1.7 million people in its pursuit of a utopian society, shows how ideological extremism can dehumanize entire populations. All these goes to enforce the idea that we all have the capacity for evil, and therefore villainy embedded in our psyche. But perhaps the greatest villain archetype of all is Lucifer, the brightest and most loved of the angels, who rebelled against God and was thrown out of heaven, becoming the devil, the personification of absolute evil. He appears as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who tempts the first humans to commit an act of pride, leading to the first act of disobedience and the fall from paradise. In Paradise Lost, published in 1667, John Milton depicts Satan as an ambivalent character whose rebellion against God is driven by a desire for independence and a refusal to submit to what he perceives as tyranny. He famously declares, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein portrays the mad scientist Victor Frankenstein creating a sentient creature through reanimating dead tissue, only to be horrified by the consequences of his actions and abandoning the creature. The creature compares himself with Lucifer, the fallen angel, as depicted in Paradise Lost. He does not understand why he was disowned and alienated from society, and why people are afraid of him and despise him. When he sees his reflection in a pool, he realizes his appearance is hideous, and it horrifies him as much as it horrifies humans. The creature grows fond of a poor family and secretly performs tasks to help them. Eventually, he approaches the family in hopes of befriending them, but he is attacked and has to flee. He becomes enraged by the way he is being treated and loses all hope of ever being accepted by humans, which starts his killing spree. Lucifer's defiance and the creature's malevolence are not born of pure malice, but of a longing for freedom and self-determination, and of the need for acceptance. In Lucifer's rebellion, we see a reflection of our own struggles against authority, our own yearning to carve out our identity, even at great cost. We also see the pain of rejection in the actions of Frankenstein's creation. This raises another question. How do you confront your own duality? No story captures the duality of human nature more vividly than Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Henry Jekyll, a respected scientist, becomes obsessed with the idea of separating the good and evil within himself. Through a potion, he transforms into Mr. Edward Hyde, a creature of pure-eyed, unrestrained, amoral, and violent. At first, Jekyll revels in the freedom Hyde provides, but he soon loses control over his transformations, and Hyde begins to dominate his life. Jekyll's story is a profound exploration of the shadow self. Hyde is not an external enemy, but a manifestation of Jekyll's repressed desires and impulses. As Jekyll himself reflects, I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that, of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. The tragedy of Jekyll and Hyde lies in Jekyll's inability to integrate his shadow. Instead of confronting his darker impulses, he seeks to eliminate them, which only gives them greater power. As Jung warned, the shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. Jekyll's failure to navigate this passage leads to his ultimate destruction. The story of Jekyll and Hyde forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that we all have a Hyde within us, a part of ourselves that we suppress or deny. What parts of your personality do you find difficult to acknowledge? Jekyll's story reminds us that the path to wholeness lies not in eradicating our shadows, but in integrating them. In the end, the villain is not an external force, but a part of ourselves that we must confront and integrate. By embracing the darkness within, we can transform it into a source of light, and in doing so, become more fully human. The villain is not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new chapter, challenging us to confront our shadows and embrace our complexity.